Welcome. My name is Stephanie Hollum, and I'm going to be moderating this session called Using Children's Literature, A&OER in an Undergraduate Psychopathology course. The presenter is Dr. Sean Forrest Geiling. Dr. Geiling is a licensed psychologist in private practice, as well as a professor in the Department of Psychology and Counseling at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau. Now, please note, live captioning is available during this presentation. You just have to toggle to get that set up. And if you have questions with that, you can message us and we will help you with that. The session will be recorded and provided on the conference website following the conference. A copy of the presentation, if provided by the presenter, will also be available. And please enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer them throughout the presentation where appropriate. And we encourage you to engage with us and other attendees through the chat feature. If you have any technical issues, let me type in the email you can use. And we are ready to go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. So welcome, everybody. As Stephanie said, this is a presentation, looking at psychopathology, but trying to also look in general at A&OER connected to that. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll talk through this collection of slides here. All right. So as was stated, using children's literature, A&OER in an undergraduate psychopathology course, and I am Sean Geiling. I teach here at Southeast Missouri State University. This is my 15th year, and I'm trying to always branch out to new things, and A&OER being something that I know a lot of you would not consider a new thing, but probably something I'm branching out in more and more and trying to add to my repertoire. All right. So some introductory topics just to get rolling. First off, I already said welcome, but certainly thank you for coming. I know there's some other opportunities that you could be at, so I do appreciate you coming to this. I know Stephanie just talked about chat. I had put if you did do a hand up, but I see that I don't really see you anyway. So obviously the chat would be your option, and I appreciate that she's going to check that. And so to feel free to jump in whenever, because I actually don't mind being interrupted. If it's something very pertinent to what we're talking about, it's almost better for everybody to talk about it right then. Maybe I won't have video difficulties, but we had an upgrade just the other day with Zoom, and I've been having kind of weird freezing pictures. And so hopefully that doesn't happen. It doesn't seem to cause problems with the audio, but my face freezes and it's a little embarrassing. And so I'll hide my face and then put it back up, and that seems to fix it. But so far we haven't had that issue, so that's good. And I also want to point out, I do not consider myself an A&OER expert. I'm just someone that's sort of trying these things out, realizing that I actually did a whole lot more A&OER than I thought I did. There was a lot of things that I have done for years that I didn't realize people considered in that category. So we'll talk about some of that toward the very end. So we'll do a quick presentation overview, a very quick discussion of what A&OER and what is it and why am I using it. I know that a lot of people will already know that, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. Just an overview of the college student users of all kinds of materials, but A&OER specifically in this case. A literature review that I did to try to determine just how much our library books as A&OER used, given that's my specific usage today. Then the actual course that I teach this in, and then the actual activity as part of the course, and then any future directions, that make sense. And just so you're aware, Stephanie Hollum actually is at the same university I am, and so she helped me with some of this project. So at a point or two, I'm going to ask her maybe to jump in and say a couple things too from her perspective. Okay, so the overview, given that the title strengthen teaching and learning with A&OER, that's the focus, that's the title, it's a worthy goal. My decision to participate was to think through what have I been doing with A&OER and how has that strengthened my teaching and learning. So, this year it just all really lined up and made sense that I would participate, certainly in telling this. Learning objectives, that I put out there. Hopefully there's a few others that I didn't think about at the time, but just basically understanding how these materials strengthen teaching and learning in general, and then a psychology specific example of how this material strengthens the training of future mental health professionals. And I'll talk more about who those students are in a little bit. So, as you probably already know, affordable and open educational resources. These are free to use. These come in many media, a variety of medium. Open license or public domain, textbooks, full courses, tests, software, just a variety of material that is used above and beyond the traditional textbook, kind of as part of the very traditional lecture discussion format of a class. And like I said a while ago, learning through this over the past few semesters, I'm realizing that I have been adding this in, but it isn't always something that I have immediately thought about and realized like, hey, that was A&OER, and that was something that counts as that. And so this particular project and 4 or 5 others that it actually made me think about to talk about today are the focus of this. So why would that be a focus? Why would I try to add that stuff? Students, as we know, don't read as much of the text as we would like. I mean, I'm sure a good portion of them don't read the text at all, but some do, but certainly not as much as would be really helpful for the discussion most class periods. So thinking about what would provide a novel way of engaging them with the material, A&OER comes into that equation. Thinking of these library books, going to a library, all kinds of varieties of materials, YouTube videos that connect them to certain topics. Something that would reduce some of the reading, yet get the point across is always something that we're always looking for to try to engage them and keep them connected as much as possible. And then me personally, I do like to go different places at different times. I like to work with different people. So liking a library, liking books, liking going on field trips, getting out of the regular classroom, liking to collaborate with other colleagues. You can do that with anything, obviously, but this just seems to be even more available to you using A&OER materials, as we will discuss. So all of those are reasons why I chose to do this project, and then chose to tell people about it. All right, a few definitions just so that we are all on the same page when we're talking about it later. So abnormal psychology and psychopathology come up a lot in the discussion of this course, because that is, of course, what the course is about. Both of them technically might be listed as a study of mental illness or psychological disorder. Now, just so you're aware, a quick background, the phrase abnormal psychology is under debate as a phrase that is not user-friendly, a phrase that is somewhat judgmental and might marginalize populations that are already potentially marginalized. So the phrase abnormal has been called into question. Now, it still exists in a lot of psychology classes, and so it is in a lot of the literature that I have reviewed. But the phrase psychopathology has been discussed more so as a potential alternate term. It carries its own baggage, but that's the best we've got for now. And my class is listed as childhood psychopathology. So, mental illness and psychological disorders that occur in children. And then mental health, this may or may not come up, but it's sort of just the state of being free from concerns of psychopathology. So if we're talking about they have mental health, they're fortunate to have mental health. Well, free from the majority of concerns of psychopathology that our textbook would be covering, and that some of the children's literature is also trying to give us examples of. Okay, so since I am a licensed psychologist, and this is a class that's trying to equip students to potentially go out and work with people with mental health concerns, and I had already been to a training last week about our current crop of undergraduate students and their mental health concerns and other difficulties, it just made sense to make a quick comment about who are the student participants that would use these materials and others. So a quick overview. I mean, there's no one size fits all, of course. There are lots of well-adjusted future success stories out there, students that are wonderful to work with, they're organized, they're together, but there are also others that are struggling in a variety of ways. And given that we're using these books to try to help train students to work with people that experience those difficulties, it makes sense to chat about this for just a minute, I think. So I won't read the whole thing to you, but the idea here is that in trying to describe the current college student population, these are phrases that have been sort of advanced as describing more than not. So difficulties with problem solving, a tendency to become embarrassed quickly if someone makes them feel like they didn't know what they were doing or they didn't know, and then the spotlight was sort of shown on them. Screen time with minimal guidance, to sort of determine like this is an appropriate thing, this is helpful to my self-esteem, or it's not helpful to my self-esteem. A low frustration tolerance, a high expectation of reward without sort of a long-term effort policy, and then not as much in-person interaction and ability to develop emotional relationships and depth. And that's to some degree due to COVID, but also due to social media, creating extra levels of barrier. And so when I think about these activities, like going to the library and using books that describe children that are having difficulties, emotional regulation difficulties, frustration, grief, loss, anxiety, it is more so likely that I need to think about who is actually reading the book too, because my college students also are probably going to see themselves in these texts, and a lot of them will, and they often talk about it. It sort of becomes a theme to better explore and understand. This slide sort of becomes real because of things like this. The fact that, according to the CDC very recently, sadness and anxiety are definitely on the rise. We've had high profile COVID-19 difficulties, social media, toxicity, mass shootings in the news, bullying. So all these exacerbate the stress that the students are experiencing. Hopelessness, depression, suicide rates. These are their worlds. I mean, most semesters, there's a lot of discussion about a friend back home who harmed themselves or ended their life, or they feel despondent, or, there's been an assault, or they've lost some loved ones. There's always 3 or 4 students out at any given time for some loved one who has died, that further complicates whatever difficulties they had going on at the time. So again, not to make it seem like every single younger person you run into is destined for a psychiatric facility, but it is helpful to understand this is where they're coming from, so that when I have them read some of these, I can, help understand where does that help them further define themselves based on, this current view of themselves, their world, the people around them. All right, so then switching gears here. So a short literature review that tries to address the rationale for why you would use library books or any other A&OER material, but in this case, it was library books, in college. Is that such a thing? Why would you do that? Do people do that? And the answer is to some degree, yes. Maybe more so than the literature shows. There's a little bit out there about it, but certainly people probably do it more than they write about it, hopefully. Talking about, understanding this. So a psychology class or a psychopathology class, whether it's looking at adult, child, adolescent development. So courses in this area have for some time been reviewed to try to understand how do they deliver the content, what is best. It turns out, there have been a few options as to try something different along the way, as opposed to just a direct lecture, discussion, take a test, or just lecture, take a test, lecture, take a test. There's been a variety of articles that have discussed how are we going to deliver this content, what is best. So more about that. This is kind of just the general intro. So one example, Glenwick and Shabbat, combining class presentations with guest lectures. So bringing people from, the quote unquote real world who have experienced the work in this field, and doing some sort of applied experience. Now they called it practicum, but maybe it was just some sort of shadowing experience in a facility, an agency, somewhere where they were practicing mental health. So these being ways that they tried to expose them to the real world, tried to do more than just the text, tried to go above and beyond that. Mateo and you talked about these sorts of things can help, these sorts of opportunities to learn through can help reduce stigma toward those with psychopathology. So people with mental health concerns. Through class presentations, still a part of it, but also video and then direct contact. I don't know if direct contact begins to be thought of as an open educational resource, but in this way, it sort of felt enough like that to go ahead and add it. But the idea that you would actually hear straight from the source, someone that is experiencing some sort of psychopathology, and working with them, going through a structured interview or doing some activity with them to help you determine how much can you better understand them and then reduce the stigma that you might have had toward them. And the findings were that the direct contact helped lessen social distancing from someone that you initially thought was awkward or concerning to you, and so you just sort of shunned them. So after direct contact, and we've seen this in other fields, that the more you connect with something and see it from another person's perspective, you are less likely to socially distance afterward. Historically, when psychopathology or related courses have attempted to incorporate reading, they have been longer works. And the two that came up the most in a analysis were I Never Promised You a Rose Garden and An Unquiet Mind. So both of those obviously address, mental health concerns in different ways. They're written in different eras. And, that study was in 2003. So it would be interesting to see if people have changed that. I know that sometimes when people who are teaching classes, they get on one thing, they don't often update it, or sometimes they don't update it. And so you end up with the same books or the same materials always sort of being directed toward the students. And if you want them to read more, contemporary work, you probably need to update your list. There's nothing wrong with these, but there's probably a few others that maybe should also be considered. But the problem with these for me is I know that students are not going to read the text assignments. So why would I then ask them to read another lengthy book to add to that information? Which is why the whole idea of how can I get them to read something? How can I get them to use this material that is beyond the scope of the book, and think of this material in a way that is as applied to real life as possible? Because I can't just send them out to work with a client, obviously. So how could I apply it as possible? So children's books, seemed like the way to go, because you can read that in a short amount of time. You can digest what's going on. There's a lot of pictures to help sell a lot of messages that you don't have to be quite so daunted by a large book that you're trying to read. So I'm not saying reading a longer work is bad in any way. It's not. I would love to have a class who wanted to do that, but that's not often what I would have at my disposal. So the children's books make a difference in that way. All right, another article also talked about you can do some of this similar work with memoirs and autobiographies. They weren't necessarily using okay, so these are books, but more focused books than some of the others that, like I Never Promised You a Rose Garden or An Unquiet Mind, to better understand psychopathology, which is true. The findings on this, that it may enhance your understanding of psychopathology through real world application. Again, the main drawback here for me would be that it would just be so long to take time out of the semester Where are they getting the information? Because I probably wouldn't believe that they were reading it. So, but another avenue for potential use. Essentially, if we're trying to understand what, so why would we bother even reading books at all? The reason for addressing psychopathology in multiple ways, whether it's through direct contact or through a book or through a memoir or whatever, is to decrease stigmatization and marginalization of those with psychological disorders. Now, in my students, it's also to just literally try to learn the material so that they would be prepared for their future clients or future graduate school. A strength-based approach that allows for normalizing and destigmatizing. Both of these particular articles just talking about that for anyone reading material that's related to psychopathology, one goal would be destigmatizing feelings toward people. And so books, as an example of A&OER in this case, make a lot of sense to do that. All right, and then Freeman, Feeney, and Moravchik from 2011, they were the one article that I found that discusses children's literature. Now, it wasn't specific to a psychopathology class, but it certainly is connected well enough. So it may be that using children's literature is not that uncommon in adult courses. Now, the authors use it all the time. Nobody else much is writing about that. And, I don't know how many people are doing that. It seems like a no-brainer and a good idea to me, but they certainly are promoting it and very happy. I feel like they'd be very happy with me for doing that. So what are some positives or what are some things that it does for you? It aids in understanding course content because it provides an approachable level. So literally, if it's 15, 20 pages with mostly pictures and a few words, that is so much more approachable than if it is this large book that you are not going to read all the pages in. So you can get a quicker, digestible course understanding of that material. It enhances appreciation for quality children's literature. You could do some sort of bibliotherapy in your private practice down the road if you were being trained in this way and you understood the value of children's literature, the books that were available, picking quality versus some other options, and just being better aware of what children respond to, what characters are informing them, each generation, so on and so forth. And then a better understanding of the child's point of view. So a potential training opportunity, you're seeing things, the words they would use, the way they would make sense of, a fear or a loss, and trying to use that as best you can. Because again, especially at an undergraduate level, and sometimes even at a graduate level, it's not ethical to just give them a child to review. They don't have the select training, and they need to do all that under great supervision. So reading from their perspective is a next step way to try to address some of this training opportunity. Also, providing a historical or cultural perspective on childhood topics, contributing to encouraging and creative learning environments. There's just a lot of opportunities for color and space usage and images. I'm looking at some of the books that are sitting on my desk right now that I'm going to show you here in a little bit. But just the imagery alone takes you to a different place, helps you understand things from a different perspective. There's no reason why adults couldn't participate in that same sort of reading. Providing a positive respite from rushed routines. So a simple sort of calming story even if it's addressing grief or loss, there's imagery, there's words, there's phrases that are written at a level that sort of take you back to a time when you were a little younger, a little more naive, a little more protected, whatever have you. But returning you to that, sort of taking a break from the rush from topic to topic that so many of us end up experiencing. And then also just contributing to personal growth or understanding of self. And that's sort of why I kept the slides in there about who are the college students that we work with, and what kind of difficulties do they have. Processing through more accessible and approachable texts might actually help them understand themselves and why that happened to them in the past down the road. I mean, it's very common that things will happen in class in a variety of ways. And someone will say, oh, well, that's why I did this. I see that now, that's why my mom and I, blah, blah, blah. That's why my cousin is doing this, that personal connection. All right, so we said all that to then get us to the point where we were talking about the actual course and the activity. I'm trying to be mindful of our time. I'm thinking I'm doing pretty good here. All right, so the course, basic information. So it is, as I said, POI 444, childhood psychopathology. And the syllabus description is that it's just a survey of a clinical description, causes, and treatment of major forms of abnormal behavior evident during childhood and adolescence. Abnormal just being the word that is used for the behavior that we don't expect usually to see in people, in children and adults. This class is focusing specifically on childhood and adolescence. The purposes and goals, I just want to have shown them to have a sense of theoretical perspectives, major assessment methods, how you would assess someone to decide they had a disorder, using the DSM-5 TR, developing understanding of the course and treatment of categories of diagnosis, developing possible prevention. So all of these are reasons we have the course and reasons that we establish some foundations at the undergraduate level, knowing that they can go on to the graduate level, knowing then they go on to licensure and professional practice after that. But it's sort of like you heard it here first, and this is information that's valuable to think about. And then course student learning outcomes. So we want them to be able to understand that there are criteria for psychological disorders and symptom presentation, to demonstrate knowledge of suspected causes of these psychological disorders, and to demonstrate knowledge of treatments of these disorders. So just broad headings. The students in the course are upper level, juniors and seniors, around 35 per semester. So I have 35 face-to-face students in the fall, and then 35 online students in the spring. So we always alternate between fall and online. I'm sorry, between face-to-face and online. Every now and then a student has to take it in a format that they didn't really want to, but it depends on what semester they need it. But we have an online bachelor's in psychology and a face-to-face one. So we try to make sure this class is available to everyone. And so most of our majors are in that. So it's mostly psychology, but I also do have family studies students, child development majors, social work majors, and then a few other things, but those would be the main listing of majors that I would have. And so these are students that are nearing the point of leaving either for an internship. Some are graduating and they're going to work in agencies, so they're going to get a job right away and have a caseload and be a case manager for a variety of people with a variety of disorders, adults and children potentially, that they would benefit from understanding the backstory to these kinds of diagnoses. And then some are also going on to graduate school, so this is sort of a foundation launching pad for them. The course content, just so you have a sense, normal versus abnormal, exploring the usage of those terms, diagnosing people, providing labels, and then the specific types of psychological disorders. So if a child was diagnosed with very low cognitive functioning, intellectual disability, if a child was diagnosed with autism or somewhere on that spectrum, autism spectrum disorder, difficulties with hyperactivity, impulsivity, inattention, so ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then a general discussion of trauma and stress that goes along with this particular activity. I use that in that particular chapter. Mood and anxiety disorders, depression, obsessive compulsive kind of things that are related to that area. And then there's some other catch-all ending chapters that we don't use as much for this activity for sure, but like eating disorders, other health concerns, substance use disorders, etc. But that's the kind of material that they would be covering in this particular course. All right, so the activity. So the decision to use A and OER to explore the topic in a different way, I've kind of already discussed, but essentially the desire to explore psychological concerns in a different manner with different materials that they could have a different engagement with. So we take a trip each semester to Kent Library, which is our library on campus, the Instructional Materials IM Center. And this has allowed for a collaboration among other collaborations that we've had. But in this particular case, with Professor Stephanie Hollum, one of our education information librarians, she has, we've worked on how we would do this, and we've kind of tweaked it each semester, so we're always tweaking it. But selecting the books and then choosing a book to read, those are the roles that she plays. And Stephanie, I was going to invite you if you want to jump in here, like what you how you go about selecting those books for the activity.
Thank you. Yes, so I look at a variety of different areas. Sometimes these are related to grief or maybe displacement like refugees, thinking about different contexts that the children may be in while they are having different disorders. Sometimes we've had everything from maybe grandma's losing her memory, dad has to go to the military. It's just a very big variety of issues. And it really, as Dr. Geiling said, puts students into someone else's shoes to see the perspective. I give some brief anecdotal stories of my experience prior to being a librarian as actually a school counselor, and I used a lot of kids' books. It's a great way to get people's attention and start conversations. So I share a few of those stories. Also, I read a book, and I think if you've ever read The Rabbit Listened, it is just the quintessential example of being a good counselor. It's letting someone listen and process through what they're dealing with.
All right, thank you. Then so that'll come up in a minute too, to just look at the steps that we go through. But that collaboration is part of it. And then development of the brief lesson, the directions, the activity. The class is about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So you kind of have to make sure there's enough time to get over there, get back to other parts of campus from there, have time to look through the books, pick one you'd like to read, sit down and actually read it, etc., etc. All right, so on the following slides, I'll go through the rest of that material. So the activity, I give a brief lesson, just kind of making sure they understand trauma and stress and maltreatment. And again, there's many other topics that we could use, but it works well in this chapter, and so many difficulties that may show up as another psychological disorder later stem from some sort of trauma or stress or so forth. All right, so in this brief lesson, I remind them that a significant number of children and adults experience varying levels of trauma, stress, maltreatment. There are a variety of therapies that exist, but again, we can read about them in our text, but that's really, we're not going to go out and do therapy with someone. But and that's where a lot of these books come in, and the one that Stephanie talked about, the Rabbit Listened, which she turned me on that book. I did not know that book, but I do love it so much. That there are ways to intervene in small ways much sooner than worrying about if you can get them to some other counseling session. If it's something that they just need to be heard. So like I capitalized listening here, people overlook that so often and are not really present there for the child or with the child. And it is so valuable. Easily overlooked, but so important. So the trauma and children's book activity, there's a brief trauma overview, which I just went through. Then I have Professor Hollum present her part of what she wants them to know about the IM Center, the books, the materials that we're using. She does I didn't ask her what word to use, but I would say a dramatic reading of The Rabbit Listened. And the students really, I mean, so they're being read to, they're 19 and 20 and they're being read to by this adult with this children's book. And, you know, it seems like it goes well. I never have anybody that gets too bothered by it. It's like it really starts to mean something to them. They understand that. So I have them go through the 30 or so options, pick a book, and then pair up with someone that they try to not normally work with. They read the book, they tell their partner about the book. So they don't necessarily have to read the book to them, but at least tell them about it. And then let their partner tell them about their book. Then they discuss their thoughts about this, and then there's a worksheet to complete, which we'll look at in a minute. Then they turn that in after a group discussion. So we do read it individually, discuss it in a small group, then come together as a large group, discuss some themes, and then, you know, that's the class period. Some book examples that we have used. So Lubna and Pebble by, because I can't read that, and there's a sticker over the name here, by Wendy Medower and Daniel Egnius. Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, Shadow by Susie Lee, and then The Rabbit Listened by Corey Dorfeld. If there's enough time, I'll come back and we'll look at one or two of those, but I'm mindful of my time here. But these are examples. So these are laid out on the stacks with, you know, 20 or so others, and the children kind of dig through, find one that works with them. The Rabbit Listened, like we've already said, understanding that sometimes you just need to be able to vent your frustrations and be heard. Where the Wild Things Are, you might get in trouble, you might get your feelings hurt. And so you need time to process and cool down and take yourself to a safe space for a little bit and then calm and then come back. Lubna and Pebble has to do with, you know, she's going to have to leave where she's at with her father, a refugee, and she has a pebble that she has bonded with, and she's going to leave that with another kid that she has bonded with. It has been sort of the person that she tells her needs to, but she's moving on to a better place, and so she wants to leave it with him. She doesn't have to have that anymore. And then Shadow, it's not exactly a book about being scared of shadows. It's a lot of imagination also, but I thought of it as, if you were afraid of the dark, it's the perfect book to start looking at how that image on the wall is really something pretty fun in your room potentially. And they just so much connect to it in such a more visceral way than just words. And that one actually doesn't have any words, so it's even more perfect. All right, so the worksheet questions, what themes in the book broadly relate to trauma and mental health support? So, you know, they just got these books, they know what they know from the class, but it's not like they're experts. So I try to keep these questions as broad as possible. How do the authors get their points across? How do they do that through certain characters, certain words? You know, what sort of connects us to a mental health discussion or psychopathology discussion? Are children's books applicable to adult difficulties? And of course, pulling for the idea that most likely yes, and helping them figure that out as they're thinking through it. What would need to change, if anything, for an adult to be able to read the book? And 9 times out of 10, the class doesn't really come up with anything that they would change. The children's books sort of sell the message that they would provide to the adults. People are hurting, and they need the same kinds of supports depending on, not even necessarily depending on the age. And then what else did you notice that we should discuss? And sort of make them come up with something, and because you never know what they're going to come up with. And a lot of times that question will pull for, this was my experience as a child. And so reading this, you know, it wasn't necessarily a pebble, but it was something that I connected to. And this book sort of took me back there. And it's, you know, it's really interesting to see this cross-cultural sort of connection. The benefits of this particular activity, as I said, you know, they read through that with their partner. We answered those questions. We discussed those questions in small groups and large groups, and then they turned that in and they were done. And each class is sort of different, but the benefits that generally come along with this A&OER activity, there's an experiential learning option here that's well beyond what the textbook would have. I mean, they might have an image of something, and more often than not, a psychopathology textbook will have an image of Eeyore, for example, being sad. And that is not necessarily enough to get a point across or make really any statement, whereas these books certainly would do much more than that. It gets students engaged with books in a different way than a traditional lecture or the traditional textbook. It aids in skill development. So just using children's literature in the classroom or therapy, understanding what options you have at your disposal. And then if you are going on specifically in my field, practicing with sort of pretend clients, thinking of these as clients and how the book talked about helping them, you can also consider for helping your future clients, or maybe even a book just to look through together with a child to better understand diagnosis, situation, empathy, development, etc. All right, so nearing the end here. So future opportunities and considerations that are related to A&OER. So some future directions with this particular project. Actually, we have expanded it to one of my other classes. So I'm working with Professor Hollum for my PY 230 Ethics and Diversity and Psychology class, where we're doing essentially the same idea. There's books put out, but these are more on, LGBTQ, gender and sex, race, other identity sort of things, religion. So any sort of category that fits with diversity. I suppose there could be some ethics ones, but the diversity one works easiest here with children's books. But books that are looking at the perspective from a child's perspective on a variety of these topics that are very approachable and palatable. And we've done it once. I've done this project 3 times. And then we've done the ethics and diversity ones, and it worked just as well. So I'm very likely continuing that. And then uses in PY 444 to continue. So we have expanded into an online version. All this again with Professor Hollum's help, but the online version has been a little trickier because obviously they're not going to the library with me. So we have to find yet other A&OER options to connect to this activity, which one has, of course, there's a lot of YouTube videos where people read some of these books to children. I'm sure a lot of that started during COVID-19 and maybe it was even before. But lining up those kind of videos also allow for viewing these books in a different way. Somebody is reading them to you. I sort of looked I kind of curated the list and found the ones that were the readers I felt like read it as straight to the reader as possible, as opposed to putting a lot of their personal views into it, because there's a lot of differences out there. But certainly that online version, I don't want them to miss out just because they can't go to the library with me. And this particular spring, we are doing the online version of this activity later in April. And then fine tuning some other A&OER that I already also do that I sort of didn't really think about, but are. So like I have a DSM-5 TR activity where you go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and you find a psychological diagnosis and you use some of that material, but they do it all online. And then I have a children's observation activity. We used to go to the children's school on campus, but when COVID came, we couldn't just hang out with children. And so I curated a whole bunch of specific videos that I use where I have them sort of tell me, some abnormal behavior, some normal behavior, some interesting behavior, some confusing behavior. Make a list of this as you watch these videos. And these are just people taking videos of their children and posting them in varieties of places on the internet. So we use that material also to just do our observations. And then, of course, in the future, looking at data collection on this activity that I've not really done. It's mostly just been an activity to see how that goes in getting the points across in learning, but I know there's probably some other opportunities for that. And I'd be interested in other ideas or input of what could be done with something like this. So I think that is my main points. There's probably other things to say, but I'll pause for now and say what questions or anything might there be that has come up that we want to discuss here for a few moments.
I haven't seen any questions in the question and answer or any in the chat, but please feel free to submit anything you have right now or comments or ideas that this sparked.
And I would be a little bit interested if anybody else is using children's books, in some ways, to get points across for their classes too.
Can I share about other classes I've used? So we have an introduction to the university class. It's called UI 100. And at one point it was a 3-credit class. It is now a 1-credit class. But when it was a 3-credit class, I was actually a professor of record at that point. And I used sometimes some of the issues that came up, whether that be kind of more like problem solving and time management sorts of things, or diversity related things. I would bring in children's books just to start the conversation, because it's a really easy way for students to think about things that isn't scary. Instead of saying, well, what do you think? There's nothing to build the conversation on. And the reception was excellent.
Mhm. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but I also had, I mean, and you tell me if you agree, but I always felt like the students, they didn't just shun this, this was something that they took fine, they absorbed it and they sort of rolled with it. And I guess I was thinking a little that they would be mad at me for deciding this was beneath them, but yeah, nobody has done that.
I've also worked, we have a program on campus, which is called the Trauma Informed Professional, and it's a collaboration between the psychology department, as you know, and the child and family studies and the education department. And we purchased a grant for that. And I know those students use those books. A lot of them are the children's books. And so, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities within that.
Mhm. And what were you saying the other day about the grant for the ethics and
Oh,
diversity?
yeah, I'm currently working on an internal grant for having children's books written from diverse authors and illustrators. So there's more voices to hear and to share and get those different perspectives.
Mhm. Yeah, so that'll only enhance the next time we do that in our class projects.
Exactly what I've been thinking.
Looking forward to that. Well, maybe there's no questions.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. Please note that you will be getting a survey about the overall conference as well as the individual sessions, and that will be arriving after the conference. The next session that we have coming up is at 3 o'clock. It is integrating open educational resource praxis and feminist pedagogy in gender, women's, and sexual studies. And then at 3:30, there is OER aspects of ICT literacy in the workplace. I will put those links as well in the chat here. So you can have access to those if you would like to join those. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.